Good friend of the program. He is Sam Amick, and he is back. Sam, what's going on? How are you?
Romy, doing great, brother. How are you, sir?
Good, dude, good. So good to have you back, Sam. Thanks for making time for us. Game one of the finals tonight. As you write for The Athletic, Boston and Golden State, Sam, have taken really different paths to the finals. The Celtics look like an absolute mess in December. They were sitting in 11th place in the middle of January. Exactly what has changed for them since that time?
I mean, they had a bit of an identity crisis, and Ime Udoka, to his credit, kind of took it head on. They're sitting there at 23-24 record-wise at the time, and Ime in his first year, a lot of coaches, I think, in their first year, having never been a head coach before, might be somewhat tentative about, taking on the franchise players, guys like Tatum and Brown, and he essentially went at them, and Marcus Smart too, on the idea of offensively they weren't selfless enough. They were pounding the ball too much. And then leaning into the defensive side and how great they are there. Tough conversations. One particular film session where Ime had put together a video clip of essentially 75 terrible plays from a 5-game West Coast trip they had early on and kind of, publicly shamed, at least within that group, everybody who wasn't bringing it well enough. And it was one of those things where coaching-wise, as long as you make it clear that nobody is immune to the criticism and the analysis, then, that's how the culture was going to be. And it resonated. And these guys figured it out. They got healthy, too. They had some injury stuff at the time. But it's one of the most unique and impressive turnarounds that I've seen in all my time covering the league.
Agreed. It's amazing. Sam Amick is joining us. So, Sam, in terms of Golden State, if we were to go back even further prior to this year, I mean, it's worth repeating that the Warriors dynasty looked like it was done after they lost to the Raptors in the finals. They had lost Kevin Durant in free agency. They lost Klay Thompson for multiple seasons. They were piecing things together with guys like D'Angelo Russell. All of that said, how impressive is it that 3 years later they are right back in the finals again?
Yeah, I mean, it's stunning. We talk about the in-season turnaround and how incredible that is for Boston. Like you said, Jim, the Warriors thing is just kind of a bigger arc. But, I mean, if you would have asked me if they were going to contend for titles post-Kevin Durant, post-Klay Thompson with these two devastating injuries, even Steph Curry being as great as he is, I didn't see it. And I didn't see it this year. So then they get off to that 18-2 start, and you're going, good Lord, okay, I guess they're back. And, we thought that was going to be the team we saw. But then they had their own injury stuff, and they just weren't playing as well, and they kind of went up and down again. But it's impressive, and it's one of those things now where the legacy discussion that we always have, not just individual players, but kind of teams and eras, these guys have a real chance to put themselves, even more in that conversation with the old Bulls teams and some of those Lakers teams and the Celtics from back in the day. So, they got a lot on the line, too.
Agreed. Sam Amick is joining us. Sam, you spoke to Klay after they won the Western Conference Finals. How would you describe his mood? I mean, given everything that he's gone through, given what this game means to him, what does the return to the finals mean to him personally?
It's honestly fun to watch just from a life standpoint because, I mean, I've covered Klay since the very beginning. I remember when the Kings had a draft workout for him coming out of Washington State, and I always have this kind of memory of this kid with little peak fuzz on his face and finding his way in the NBA and turning into this kind of a player. And now he's this grown man who, take money aside. I always say, these guys make a lot of money, but, in terms of passion and enjoying what you do for a living, basketball was taken away from him for a long time. And so it has now kind of spawned this incredibly reflective, appreciative, I think, humble person who tries to soak up every experience and every day. And, when they win the West Finals, he's going down memory lane and making sure that he appreciates it and enjoys it. And it's neat to watch. And obviously he keeps finding his way in terms of his game. He's not the same defender that he was before, but he's getting there. And offensively, this guy can still give you 40, without batting an eye if you let him.
Sam Amick is joining us. Sam, what about Boston in the sense that as good as they've been, and they've been great in the second half of the regular season and even at times in the playoffs, but, man, there have been some games in the postseason where they look terrible. I mean, really terrible and inexplicable. Yeah. Games where Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown just vanish on offense altogether. Right. How do you explain that, and then how big of a concern might that be going into this series?
Yeah, I mean, I've been picking the Warriors in 6, and that's partly why, Jim, is the Celtics, as talented as they are, they've obviously never been on this final stage. They showed that kind of inconsistency earlier in the playoffs. I mean, as one, I talked to a front office executive where we had a story where anonymously these guys kind of analyzed the series, and he made a point, kind of like you are, of saying, like, they effed around a lot in the playoffs, and it makes you wonder about their consistency. And the offensive side is where they tend to lose their way sometimes, and that's where I find their makeup so interesting, because Marcus Smart, such a fantastic player, and defensively we know what he brings, but offensively a little bit of Jekyll and Hyde. He's got nights where he might be giving you 12 assists and moving that ball around like you feel like they should, and then you see him take 5 straight shots at the end of Game 7, and they almost gift wrap that thing for the Heat and send them to the final. So that is also, I think, why the series is going to be fun, because the Warriors have their own version of that. You know, Jordan Poole defensively struggles. They've got some other vulnerabilities. And I think both sides are uncertain enough, they're inconsistent enough that it's going to make for good action.
We are talking to Sam Amick for a few more minutes. Marcus Smart, Sam, to me is really interesting because I agree with you. Watching him in Game 7, I'm like, man, this dude is going to shoot them right out of this game and this series and season. He is banged up. All right, so nobody would ever question this guy's grit, his heart, his toughness. You know he's going to want to battle Steph Curry for absolutely everything, but I'm no doctor, but he does not seem close to 100%. What do you think that battle is going to look like?
It's going to be a tough one for Marcus and the rest of the group. There's a stat I keep dropping that I think is just pretty wild and mind-blowing, considering the way that it cuts into the narrative about the Celtics defense. Is as great as they are, if you take away the last matchup, where remember Steph gets hurt when Marcus Smart hits the floor, and that's the injury that wipes Steph out for a lot of the late regular season, the previous 6 matchups between the Warriors and Celtics, Steph gave those guys 35 a game, and he shot 52% from 3. So, like, the idea that, I think we still are guilty of, with Steph, thinking, oh, is he going to be able to handle this physical defense? And it's like, this dude has been destroying them for a few years now. And so you take that history combined with the fact that Marcus has got a bum wheel, that's not a recipe for success. I think it's going to be tough for them to slow Steph down.
We're talking to Sam Amick for a couple of more moments. Sam, what about that? When you talk about them being physical on defense, they are. Boston likes to be really physical on defense. So how important is the officiating going to be in this series? And is this something that you expect to be consistent throughout the series, or might it actually change game to game?
Tough to tell on that one. I do think the officiating is going to be massive in terms of its importance, because if it's going to be, 80s playoff basketball, then it's probably Boston in 5 or 6. You know what I mean? Like, the Warriors won't be able to compete with that. But the Warriors are the team that, if you had to pick kind of a poster child of the NBA's freedom of movement philosophy that they've emphasized in this era, that aids a team like the Warriors more than anybody with the way they function offensively. So that is the part where it's always tough to analyze it and figure out, where the refs' minds are going to be and what the conversations are behind the scenes. But it's going to be a huge factor for sure.
Sam, I hate talking about the officials. I never want to talk about it, but it seems to me in this matchup especially, it's huge. It is huge how they officiate this series. Let me ask you this before you go. It seems like every single time you and I talk over the last few years, we always end up talking about the Lakers. I have to keep the tradition alive then. What do you make of their choice of Darvin Ham as their head coach?
I like it. I give them credit for, not going. They're going for a guy who has been considered, unofficially kind of next up in the assistant coaching ranks for quite some time, and a guy who's got a lot of respect. But the Lakers in the past have, made moves, whether it's going to get a Westbrook or chasing, the biggest free agent out there. They are a star organization, right? And I thought, maybe they'd make a mistake in this coaching search early on of just chasing a name. And they didn't do that. Darvin is going to be unproven, of course, because that's the nature of being a first-time head coach. But his toughness is well chronicled. His, ability to connect with stars and to be tough on them. And I think his profile is actually somewhat analogous to an Ime Udoka. And I think that, I don't know exactly if this was part of the Lakers' calculus, but, I would have to imagine if you see the Udokas out there, Willie Greens out in New Orleans. You see, teams having success with head coaches who haven't done it. When you find special qualities, you should go ahead and kind of gravitate to that rather than worrying about the resume and what hasn't been on it. So, but with them, this, like the roster's flawed, and that's going to, at the end of the day, determine how they do.
Exactly. I was going to say, wait, what? The Lakers made a good decision? Oh, wait a minute. Their roster's garbage. But I agree with you, though. I think they made potentially a good decision. He's a senior NBA writer for The Athletic. He is host of the Tampering Podcast, and every time I bring him on, it's a good decision on my part. Sam, I appreciate it so much. Thank you very much. Great talking to you.
Likewise. Thanks, Romy. Appreciate you.
You're the best, Sam. Appreciate you. What a pro.